begin the work session that is the update on SCYPT, the Children's Behavioral Health System of Care Blueprint. But we will be talking about quite a few issues related to SCYPT. So, board members, I don't know if you guys realize this is televised, so if anybody's actually watching our tape, I imagine they couldn't even hear what I actually said is happening next. So, if you need to extend your conversations, you're welcome to step outside, but otherwise, out of respect for our staff and our visiting guest here from the county, I'd like to turn it over to them for the presentation. Dr. Duran, I apologize. We don't want to give a short shortchange this, so I'll give it to you and ask for your judicious presentation efforts.
Thank you. And with me, with the team today, Marianne Penrelli, we were up here earlier, and Dr. Lip, and with joining us is Carla Bruce, and she's the Deputy Director for the Department of Neighborhood and Family Services, and Community Services, and she partners closely with us on the SCYPT. So we're here to do a couple of things. We have a lot of items that we uploaded that you can read and reference, so we're going to try and go quickly. So basically today what we'd like to do is there are some new board members, and those of you that are not new, to remind you of what is SCYPT, briefly list what are the ad hoc committees, what are the shared community outcomes, what are our current SCYPT priorities, a couple of key highlights of SCYPT actions that have taken place over the last couple of years, and that will go very quickly. And then the main part of what we'd like is to have a discussion around the One Fairfax resolution for discussion. So real quickly, what is SCYPT? What does it stand for? It's the Successful Children and Youth Policy Team. And basically what it is, it's a cross-sector team formed to collaborate efforts for all of our youth in Fairfax County. And by cross-sector, it's individuals represented from the Board of Supervisors, 2 members of the school board, and also county representatives and some of our nonprofit agencies. So what is the main purpose? The main purpose of SCYPT is to identify priorities, provide strategic direction for action, marshal resources, and then here make recommendations on policy and resource allocation. And today we do have one policy recommendation that we're bringing before you. So as I already indicated, there are members representative on the Board of Supervisors, Kathy Hudgens and Jeff McKay, and the members that are from the school board are Tammy Daranax-Kofak and Megan McLaughlin. So the vision of SCYPT is that it's a community where all children and youth will thrive and reach their full potential. The mission is up there on the screen. I won't read it for you, but you can reference it. We also have uploaded a more detailed document on the board docs that you can reference, which speaks to what SCYPT is about in more detail. Currently, there are 3 ad hoc committees that are part of SCYPT that are focusing on disconnected youth, ages 16 to 24, internet access in low-income communities, and community schools. In addition to some of the next items, which are some of our shared community outcomes. I'm trying to go as quick as I can. So I'm not going to read all the shared community outcomes, but I will highlight a couple of them that are ones that SCYPT has been looking at in particular, and that's really around academic success of students, entering kindergarten ready to succeed. So it's a lot of pre-K, preschool access issues, and really making sure that we have children that are ready to be positive contributions in the community. So some of our current key priorities are listed up there. There are 4 of them. Again, I've already mentioned that a major one for us is kindergarten readiness, access to a quality preschool, behavioral health, social and racial equity, and school attendance and chronic absenteeism. Now, in the area of kindergarten readiness, this board and the Board of Supervisors, since SCYPT has been in place, have put additional funding into both budgets on the county side and also on the school district side, and both have included wording on this in both our strategic plan and some of the actions that are happening at the county level. For example, in the area of kindergarten readiness, the SCYPT endorsed a multi-year plan to increase access, and at the county level, there was an additional effort and resources put into funding in fiscal year 15 and 16 to begin implementation of that plan, which has resulted in 8 new schools participating in the neighborhood school readiness teams. This came out of SCYPT's recommendations, which has resulted in over 500 additional children being served through that partnership. We do know that there's a lot more students that do need access, and so it's an ongoing work in progress. Another area in the behavioral health aspect, in May 2014, the SCYPT endorsed a plan to increase behavioral health. As a result, the County Board of Supervisors implemented that plan by starting the development of a systems of care office and new short-term behavioral health services for children and youth, and also developed in partnership with us Behavioral Health Systems of Care Blueprint, which is a PowerPoint that is also uploaded on Board Docs, and we'll be able to talk to you more about that, not today, because that will take much more time. It is something that was endorsed recently by SCYPT, and we also hope that we will get some endorsement from the school board when we're able to present that. When we think about school attendance and chronic absenteeism, in December of 2014, SCYPT endorsed a plan on addressing chronic absenteeism, and we're also in the process jointly working with the county to identify a multi-year plan that will be presented at the next SCYPT meeting for our endorsement, and we will bring that before the school board for your review. And the last area is around social and racial equity, and in 2014, the SCYPT committee endorsed recommendations regarding what's listed on the agenda as the One Fairfax resolution, which is a policy, and we'll talk more in detail about that in a moment, around racial issues and making sure that we're concerned around equity issues across the county. What happened since then is the Board of Supervisors in a committee of the whole, in their Human Services Committee, endorsed the recommendation of One Fairfax resolution, and all of them were there because they meet in committees of the whole. And what the next step is bringing it before the school board here to look at and endorse so that there can be an official vote. The way it was explained to us by the Board of Supervisors is they've not yet officially voted on it because they're waiting for an endorsement from the school board, and then once both boards would endorse it, they could then both vote for it as a whole. So that's part of what we'd like to talk about today. Almost there to that point. And the last slide is just a couple of highlights. I've already indicated the issue around the work that was done in February 2014 around equity, the issue dealing with presentations on equity that took place, and actually some of the members of the board may remember, because I believe it was Carla who came before you to present that in the fall, or a team of another colleagues in the team came in the fall of 2014 to present on that. And then in April, the SCYPT, we've endorsed the Children's Behavioral Health System of Care Blueprint, which again, we will be able to talk to in more detail. So I went real quickly, Ms. McLaughlin, to meet your timeline. And now what we'd like to do is I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann and Carla, who are going to talk to us about the main thing we'd like to accomplish today, and that's speaking to you about our One Fairfax resolution.
Okay, so I do want to update the board that Chairman Hines has let me know that we are removing another 1 hour item on the work session that was on the new ESSA. I was trying to
ESSA
think, yeah.
update. Mhm.
So yeah, the ESSA update has been removed. So that really means we're only about 30 minutes behind at this point. So I want this to be a quality presentation and more importantly for the board to have some time to discuss.
And I will say everything that I kind of went very quickly through was uploaded. So if you have other questions, everything is referenced by documents explaining and detailing out everything I just shared. So right now, though, the main part of what we'd like to talk to you about is One Fairfax resolution.
And so the One Fairfax resolution was drafted by a committee that had school and county people working together, staff members, and was presented to SCYPT, was edited, changed, whatever, and then came forward. As Dr. Duran said, it went to the committee of the whole of the Human Services Committee. They looked at it. They felt that they would be comfortable putting it forward onto a board agenda item to have a formal vote. Before they did that, they wanted us to bring it here and have the school board also look at it. So if there was any change in language, anything like that, it could be decided ahead of time so that when it went before each board individually, it could be voted on so that jointly the two boards had endorsed or had voted for this. I will point out that the resolution itself says that there should be a intentional racial equity policy. So the policy itself might take a more extensive form. This is to say we endorse the idea that there ought to be a racial equity policy. Since this was first drafted, there have been a number of things, and I just want to draw your attention to them. Obviously, within FCPS's strategic plan, there is a clear statement about closing achievement gaps and being committed to equity for all of our students. So that seemed quite in line with this. The other document that I would refer you to was the equity growth profile. We uploaded those. There's both the very long version and a summary version, which outlined how the county actually had a loss of potential growth in terms of economic growth because of the inequities that you see. And they were spread across different ethnic groups you're able to see that it was the same educational level. So if you looked at different ethnic groups across four-year college graduates and then how much money per hour each of those groups was making, you saw that there were inequities across the board, as well as concerns about just access to, we know that about 45% of the jobs projected in the future will require at least an associate's degree. But if we look at Hispanic population, for example, only 25% have an associate's degree. So the equity growth profile message was that as our demographics shift significantly to having more and more people of color, if those demographic groups are not maintaining and have access to and are able to attain the sufficient levels of education and job preparation, then as a county, we are going to be in trouble in terms of economics. So that was put out after this original language was put in, but we looked at it again and didn't see any real need to change the language a whole lot other than to refer to the equity growth profile within the proclamation itself. So I think that the best thing to do may be to simply open it for questions as opposed to trying to go into a lot more detail.
Thank you, Dr. Panarelli. Before I begin with questions, and I do have Mr. Moon who signaled that he would like to speak, so please signal to me if you want me to add you to the list. I just want to make sure my colleagues understand kind of why the urgency to have this conversation around the one Fairfax resolution. Ideally, the SCYPT Executive Committee, when we met last week, what we talked about, what we really would hope for is our Board of Supervisors and School Board are set to have a retreat on June 14th, a joint retreat. We're going to be talking about pre-K services and, how can we get to a more equitable access to that for children in our county. And because this is something that we've been trying to show a shared one Fairfax commitment, we recognize that it might be just a really great way to launch that retreat with that shared intentionality. And so since the supervisors with our work today could potentially put the one Fairfax resolution on their business meeting, which would be June 7th, and we have a business meeting June 9th, we could technically within that week, both boards publicly signal support for this resolution and then head straight in the next week into our shared retreat, which they thought would be good from a foundational perspective that we all are on board since the message starts at the very top. So I wanted you all to know that was the hope, but today's discussion is really important to understanding where all of you are on that. Dr. Duran, you wanted to add
just
something?
clarify, they did actually put it on their agenda and they would pull it if we did not endorse it here.
Okay, so they took the next step and they preemptively said, okay, we're going to be optimistic and hope that we as a board can get there too. And that gives us about a month from today until the June 9th vote. So with that, I have Mr. Moon followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Just a couple of background questions, and then I would ask the question I do want to ask. So when the board, the subcommittee discussed the language of this draft resolution, did they actually change the language? Did the subcommittee's discussion resulted in change of any languages drafted by probably someone else, skipped, or?
We had two Board of Supervisors representatives that were present at the skipped meeting when we presented the language. There were some minor adjustments at that meeting. So by the time we got to the Human Services Committee, there were no adjustments made.
No adjustments.
Now, this has incorporated language in it. This one that you're looking at has incorporated language in it about the strategic plan and about the equity growth profile. That was not in the original one that they looked at, but it has been shared to them now as for an updated version to be considered.
So when they are seeking our board's endorsement, are they seeking a formal vote at the regular meeting, or just having a discussion in a work session and bring?
What they're looking for is if there is language that you think should be changed, perhaps through this work session, they'd like to know that. And then they would like both boards to take a formal vote on agreed on language.
Okay, now my question has to do with some specific languages. We talk about disparity in opportunities and outcomes, disparity. And I think somewhere in the resolution, I also see discrimination. And I also see racism. Are they all the same? Do you think disparities equal discrimination and also equal racism?
Yeah, I think no, so the short answer to your question is no, they're not all the same. I think what the resolution is attempting to do is for there to be a formal acknowledgement of sort of some of the historical context, which we sort of, so that we have a common understanding of our historical context as it relates to racism. And I should also mention that in the county's strategic plan for economic success, there's a reference to social equity. So while this resolution in its current state refers specifically to race equity, it also is inclusive of the concept of social equity, which is broader than race and would be inclusive of class and the like. So the answer to your question is no, those are not the same. Our intent is to acknowledge that there's a history that may have led to decision-making, resource allocation, and ultimately differences in outcomes based on those factors.
Okay, going one step further then, based upon that, on the first page, I think this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th whereas clause. In the third line, it talks about not only historical, but also current discrimination. So there's my question. So historical and current discrimination. So are we assuming there's a discrimination? Or are we acknowledging there's a discrimination? And same thing goes with what's on the back is where it talks about with that bold letter, racial equity, what that means. In the second line, it talks about eliminate institutional racism. So are we acknowledging by adopting this that there is institutional racism in Fairfax County? And if there is, because Skip has done a lot of work, if there's institutional racism, what data support to be institutional racism? Because I understand about disparities in opportunities and outcomes, but I'm trying to understand institutional racism, which is quite serious.
I'll go first. So I think, again, in the equity growth profile, there is conversation about the fact that decisions made some time ago have led to housing patterns and have led to concentrations of people of color in certain parts of the county, which are also areas where there's great poverty, which are also areas where the schools are struggling more, which are also areas where there's more difficulty with crime, et cetera, and that some of those decisions that were made earlier, whether it be how what could get a VHA loan, what couldn't get a VHA loan, et cetera. I mean, it could be beyond policies specifically made by Fairfax County, but as policies that impacted Fairfax County, have led to a continuation of an institutional racism from the standpoint of it's not that an individual person is being racist in making a decision, but certain institutions exist, certain patterns of interacting exist that perpetuate it unless you actively step in and say, we're going to do something different.
Thank you. That really helps me in thinking, thinking about this resolution.
And again, that term really references the sort of how racism manifests itself in policies and practices that may not have been the decisions made by anyone here at the table today, but again, from a historical context, so that they're deeply embedded and kind of seem as if this is just how we do it. And we're really trying to better understand, one, where those things came, what they are and where they came from, so that we can dismantle them, again, with this from this perspective of everyone in our community should have the opportunity to thrive.
Again, thank you.
Okay, next we have Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Mr. Press, and then Ms. Strauss and Dr. Garza.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing this to us. This is a really important area of work, and it's one that I am passionate about. I would urge my colleagues, if you have not read the Policy Link Report, it is a wonderful background paper on where we are in Fairfax County. And so I would urge everybody to take the time to read it. It is well worth the hour or so it will take. The second thing that I'm very optimistic about is that the language of this resolution, which I did not know you all were going to be bringing to us, but I'm pleased to see it, talks about opportunity gaps. And I'm very pleased to see this discussion crafted in the terms or through the lens of opportunity gaps, because it's broader than just achievement gaps. And so I think that's fantastic. I do wonder about the language regarding current discrimination, if there's another term we could use for it. I don't know if that's possible, or if we just eliminate the term current. Yeah. But I don't know if that's too late. It certainly is not a deal changer for me, or a deal breaker for me. But I, once again, thank you for bringing it.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett Sanders. I have Mr. Press next.
Thank you. I appreciate this as well, but I think there's a second discussion that I at least would like to get a hint at how this might impact. This resolution, I think, I can't imagine anybody would take issue with the fact that we really are trying to take on opportunity gaps. We're trying to address them, and that's a critical area of need that this system has identified. This resolution, though, when I read it, is a very, I guess the word would be abstract piece, in that it doesn't have clearly outlined policy implications for this board to take forward as we continue our work with the strategic plan and moving forward beyond that. What I see this as is a formal adoption of principles that I think we have all very clearly explained, that we're committed to equity in everything we do. But I think it, at least for me, it would be very, informative to hear how this might, if there's an example that perhaps the Board of Supervisors has tied in with this, that maybe we could also tie in to see what policy implications might be. I know, Dr. Panarelli, you mentioned bus stops, things like that. Are there other areas that you might like to address?
So one thing I wanted to just mention that it was intended to stay fairly high level and broad, to be sort of inclusive of the work of both boards and not exclusively related just to schools and specific to children and youth. So there is a paragraph toward the end that basically calls for what this resolution directs us to do is to work together to develop more specific policies and a process for how we might undertake a racial equity lens with all of our decision-making and resource allocation related decisions. That being said, part of the reason and Ms. McLaughlin had mentioned it earlier, part of the reason for bringing this forward at this time is that the joint school board work session is going to focus specifically on pre-K and early childhood options. And this is something that communities across the country have tackled from an equity perspective. And so there are a number of policies in terms of geographic location. There are and practices regarding geographic location, the type and structure of programs that will come out of this discussion with the joint boards on June 14th. So that I think you'll see a more specific application of a racial equity lens. What we're hoping that this resolution will do will give guidance to staff to develop a more specific policy so that could be sort of rolled out again with all decision making.
I appreciate that.
And if you think of something like when we now are going to build something, we do an environmental impact study. Some communities across the country have taken sort of a equity impact study to look at large major policies or changes that are going to be made, large investments of money, et cetera, to see whether the communities that they are intended to assist whether that's being done equitably. So, again, it's not that that's how it would have to be, but there are a lot of models out there that it could be implemented.
I appreciate that, and that really gives me some context in how to look at this and the implications as we move forward. My second question, I think Mr. Moon may have hit on this, and I may have missed it, but what is the specific rationale that we are taking in looking at this through a racial equity as opposed to a socioeconomic equity or a language equity? There's so many lenses we could take to this. Why is race the specific one that we've opted for?
I think, again, if we look at the equitable growth profile, what you see is that racial differences occur at every economic level in terms of how much money people are making, what access to jobs they have, what access to education. So obviously they have to go hand in hand. Poverty is going to be an impact regardless of your race, but there are ongoing, existing within our culture differences that occur that even when you account for those things, when you account for level of education, when you account for how much money you had to begin with, those sorts of things, you still get a racial differential. And so it was the belief of SCYPT that it had to be called out directly, even though there is clearly an understanding that this goes across many other social factors as well.
Thank you, Mr. Press. We move on to Ms. Strauss, followed by Dr. Garza, Ms. Evans, and Ms. Hines.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to hear the update and the progress that's being made. I think some of the takeaways that are very important is, for example, the percent of our high school graduates going on to either an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. I think that is critical. And you were saying that 45% of jobs require at least an associate degree. Are these 45% in Fairfax County or 45 nationally? Because I know Fairfax County, okay. Because I know we've had some of the stuff in here is national.
It's in 2020. it's expected
In
that
2020, okay.
45% of the jobs in Fairfax County will have.
Right, because I would think as a clear first benchmark, certainly setting goals for everybody, getting a much higher commitment to work after high school. And I know we track that, we're working on that, but I thought that's a very very descriptive place to go. Also very pleased, talking about housing patterns, certainly the school board, we have been talking with the Board of Supervisors, as you redevelop a community, please have mixed income groups. Do not have, I mean, we've done our own studies, do not concentrate high poverty in one place. Land use decisions, absolutely. And at least have a mix of low, middle, lower middle, upper middle. I'm not sure, pie in the sky to have it perfectly mixed. That's not going to happen, but at least certainly no concentrations. The other, I also like the acknowledgement of the 16 to 24-year-olds, because I think that's a critical age group. Obviously, it overlaps with us, but it overlaps with the county as well. And I see that as critical. I know we want to do a lot with pre-K, but for many of the people who are 16 to 24, their problems are pre-K is long gone. And that may or may not have been a significant need for them. But also the fact that at least we usually have transiency within the county, people coming in, people moving out, and the acknowledgement that we will have older teenagers and young adults who come with interrupted education, and that's a whole different challenge that we have, and that's a part of who we are, and we need to focus on that in a different way. And I know we've had special programs in our high schools where we're seeing that, and it's hard to know year to year how many we're going to have in that age group, but I think as an acknowledgement that this is a place to work on. The other piece that is just simply a part of human nature is we always know that we have some cultural affinity, certainly in my schools. I will have large numbers of children where there's certain cultural affinity, where they are not low income and they are not low educated, but there is a real strong cultural affinity. And we're not talking about that, right? No. I mean, that's obviously people decide where they want to live and where they are attracted to. So as we talk about these things, when we talk about equity, it is equity for a good education so that you can have a job that can support yourself, and that whatever barriers there are to either housing, education, or employment, that's where we want to make sure you have an equitable opportunity to gain access to all of that. So, great, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. Moving on to Dr. Garza.
Yes, mine will be very quick. I was going to say the same thing that Karen Corbett Sanders said, and I was just so impressed with the equitable growth profile, that report. It's a wealth of information. I need to study it even further, and I just think there's so many ways that we can use the information. I thought, for an example, the racial generation gap, I thought was it really just kind of hit you in the face. I mean, it really does, I think, illustrate some of the angst that we see in our community because we have such a big difference between young people of color versus our aging population, which is much less diverse, right? And some of those challenges we face. But anyway, I was just going to compliment you all on this work. I think this is really great work, very beneficial. I am looking forward to, I was going to ask the other question that Ben got ahead of me and asked, and that is looking forward to, so what do we do with this information? How does this impact our work? And so I think that's going to be, I think, an interesting and important next step is, okay, now that we know all of this, how does this change our work? So anyway, I was just going to say, just going to compliment you all. I think this is great work, and it's something we can all use as a resource.
Thank you, Dr. Garza. Ms. Evans and Ms. Hines, if you could include in your remarks just if you've had a chance to review the one Fairfax resolution, as some of our other colleagues have begun to sort of talk about, where where your thinking is right now on that. I think it would be very beneficial that if we do have any suggested changes, that we should offer those to the supervisors, because I think ideally we want to have a resolution that we can fully endorse by both boards, and this is the opportunity at a minimum, just today, to start that conversation. And if we can get people comfortable sooner, that's great. But I don't want people to forget that this is a big piece, is hearing how you think.
Thank you. I also want to compliment you on an amazing amount of work. This is incredibly important work. And I think one of the greatest challenges we face as a school system is the increasing gap and the increasing rise in some areas of high poverty and the increasing gap between the highest and the lowest. And I think that this, to start tackling that, we really must start tackling it. And it is something that we can't do on our own. But right now, I think we need to be figuring out what we can do about the demographic balances in our schools. Right now, we did several years ago have the tipping point study, which shows the impact the very significant impact when poverty rates get very high at schools. And it is something that I'm very concerned about. The neighborhood conditions piece is critical to this. And so I will look forward to seeing what the solutions are for that, because that's not something that we typically control on our side of things. That's a number of factors that the school system really doesn't control. I did have a couple of questions. One was very interested in the maps on child opportunity and where the gaps exist. Could you just briefly tell us what's involved in engaging child opportunity?
So yeah, child opportunity it sort of looks at this concept of opportunity structures and where, and you'll notice that there are certain areas on the map that are darker or lighter than others. And so this is opportunity in terms of education, but also in terms of health, opportunity in terms of, and again, realizing that children are a part of families, so opportunities related to the fact that that parents have access to high-paying jobs, opportunities to adequate housing. So it takes all of these measures and plots them and basically says that some children in our community have more access to opportunity than others. And that's really the construct around which we sort of frame our solutions, is really building up these opportunity structures across the county. And just in reference to a few comments that have been made, a lot of this work, and historically this work, has focused very much on the actions of the individual and making changes within individual children or within individual families. What we're really trying to do is to introduce this concept of building systems and structures of opportunity versus, putting the onus on individuals and families to make changes, solely make changes within their lives. So again, with this whole notion of building opportunity structures and then being able to say, this in this community, this is how we define sort of what opportunity looks like in terms of access to green space or access to the ability to transportation or access to libraries and things like this. So we've again, for many years as we've tackled this work, focused primarily in education and on the sort of human services side. With this One Fairfax approach, we're definitely acknowledging that so much of our system really impacts outcomes for children and youth in our community. And so this last iteration has involved our counterparts in planning and development and in economic development, again, realizing the roles that they play in terms of where sidewalks go and in the path that streets will take, in the where housing is built. All of those things sort of contribute to this whole notion of creating opportunity. But this Child Opportunity Index, and we've actually been able to take that Child Opportunity Index and map it with a lot of other challenges sort of maps we see, sort of where there may be higher incidence incidences of chronic disease or where there may be higher incidences of crime, and you see these sort of layering, it's still the same areas are what we call hotspots.
Okay. And I would say I did see that a couple of hot spots were identified. I believe it was in Mount Vernon and Lorton and a couple of other areas. Of course, the same holds true of Culmore and areas of Annandale. Those weren't noted in the documents. I believe Herndon was another area where that was a hot spot. So I guess I would urge that to be recognized, in moving forward, because those certainly are areas that we need to focus on as well. With the so yes, I want us to see us looking at neighborhood conditions from our side, what we can do in the meantime to get more demographic balance in our schools. We can't do it in a vacuum, but I think we need to be working on that as well. Going back to what Mr. Preston, I think maybe one or two others had mentioned. I guess, and to Ms. McLaughlin's point, I'll start with the resolution. I think this, I support doing a resolution of this kind. I think that what we've got there is excellent. I do, personally, I would like to see a recognition of the socioeconomic piece to it. I think, poverty has its own impact on all of these things. And I hear what you're saying about racial equity. I do, and that's a very important piece to it. But I do think that we should not ignore just the socioeconomic piece of it as well. So that would be my advocacy, to include something in there. Exactly. Yes, and housing. We've got. I talked to one principal who said, "Yes, in my part of the county, I have 2 and 3 families living in a house. In your part of the county, you have 2 and 3 families living in a 2 and 3 bedroom apartment," and that has to do with poverty. I mean, I understand there's racial components to it, but so personally, I'd like to see a recognition of that side of it as well. Thank you.
And one of the things I want to point out is that when we drafted this resolution 2 years ago, roughly at this point, we really wanted to emphasize racism from its historic perspectives. As we've talked to some of our partners, like I said, we've been more and more engaging with the sort of, we call them sort of the infrastructure folks, the planning and development folks. And so I think they have adopted this concept of social equity. And so if what I'm hearing you say is you want to hear that piece of it sort of more reflected here, we definitely want to, again, giving our history, we want to acknowledge race, but giving sort of where we live and sort of how it manifests itself in our community. Racism or issues of race perpetuate things related to class and therefore perpetuate some of the things that you're describing that are related to poverty. So we can be inclusive and incorporate both concepts, but definitely want to make sure that we underscore the historical significance of race in this community and again in our nation.
And I would support that. I would support doing that, but again, with the addition.
Yes.
So just so I'm clear, because we're going to have to try to do this and then somehow get it back to you and somehow get it to the Board of Supervisors, et cetera. So would you see another whereas that said something about the growing number of families in our community living in poverty and impacted by poverty, or something along those lines?
I think that would be an excellent suggestion to include that. We could
because
even
it does say whereas achieving racial and social equity
Right.
are an integral part, but it seems like we want to call out poverty.
Poverty and possibly even language barriers. I would have to go over it again to see if language is. Let me see. Yeah, and so I think certainly for actually for all of it, I was going to say for education, that's clearly a factor, but really for all of it, for work, for just living.
Right.
So to the extent we could add those two things, and I think a whereas, and then somehow I don't have language in my head, but to reflect it also in the part where it be it resolved. And again, this is my advocacy. I would want to see if the rest of the board is supportive of that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Evans. I think you've really raised some important points that I'm hearing echoed by other colleagues. And so next we have Ms. Hines, followed by Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, thank you. This is really good. This is a thing that we need to be doing, right? And so I do understand the focus on race, because I think the risk is that when we talk about gaps, it's easy to say, to kind of bury race in the poverty category, right? To say, well, if certain kids are not doing, certain racial group is not doing that well in school, well, it must be because their families are poor and they're not well educated and all that. So you really have to disaggregate all of that. And then when you do, you see that race is a factor no matter what else is going on. So the thing we want to be really careful, right, is not to lose that. And I think that's the point of this, is to really focus on it, and that it is particularly historically a problem. So I don't have a problem at all with, and I'm glad that Mr. Moon raised this particular vocabulary, current discrimination, because I think it doesn't have to be guys in white hoods. The reality is that it's just so ingrained in what we do. There's a lot of well-meaning but not knowing kind of discrimination that happens. And institutional racism, we know that that's everywhere. But the thing is, so in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, but I think when we look at equity as a school system, what I want to see is that we're taking basic measures of how kids are doing and disaggregating by several things, right? One is race all by itself. One is poverty all by itself. One is, and when we say race, I also want to know, are we just talking black, white, or are we also talking Latino kids? Are we talking Asian kids? We're breaking all that down, all those racial groups. Okay, so breaking that down, and then also, language barriers at home. And then for us, special ed as well. I think we've got to make sure that we're hitting that as well. So I don't have a problem with this particular initiative, thank you, focusing on race. I think that's fine, but I think that we have to recognize as a school system and a school board that that's not all of our work at all. So I don't know what to do with that, whether we need to change this or just say, okay, we jump on this, but then we as a school system and a school board work on the rest of it also, or do we want the county to partner with us in that other stuff too, which is, about poverty and language at home and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, definitely, I think that, and again, we can go back and tweak the language in here that would allow us to clearly address the topic of race and still capture these other concepts. What's important here about this whole notion of doing this as a joint resolution is recognizing that we all share, both systems as well as the community shares in terms of the responsibility and in terms of the solutions that need to be put in place in our community to address these things and to ensure that we are one Fairfax, a thriving community with thriving people. So I would definitely suggest that we go back and try and incorporate some of the themes that have come up through this conversation, but that we stay in alignment in terms of making this a joint collective effort.
I think you bring up a really good point. Our administrators really want the joint effort. After looking through a school lens for so long, they're really glad to have the county partners to look at affordable housing, to look at jobs for students, to look at public transportation, to look at libraries, to look at mental health and physical health services, to look at all of those pieces, which we really need the county counterparts to be able to have that. And our administrators talk about access. If we can have access to these programs and services countywide, that's going to make a big difference for our students.
Ms. Hines, thank you. We now have Tom Wilson, followed by Dahlia Palchek.
Yes, as a new member of the board, I appreciate this. I hadn't heard of this effort, and I certainly think it's worthwhile effort. And worth developing. I have to echo some of the comments that Chairman Hines made in terms of the language used to determine sort of what the focus will be, because it does strike me as somewhat exclusionary of the communities with disabilities, LGBT community, doesn't mention women, and there's lots of historic discrimination. And I wonder whether or not the focus of this is really to deal with the legacy of slavery, and in the South in particular, or are we really saying we're focused on income inequality and social discrimination based on sort of a person's current state of life in Fairfax County? Maybe you just can talk about that. I think that is a good point that Chairman Hines raised.
So the answer is yes. I mean, it is inclusive of, like I said, all of the sort of historical things that have happened in our community and in our country, which would also include the impacts of slavery. But again, this is not to in any way not acknowledge those other forms or those other isms that exist in our community, but to acknowledge that from the perspective of, ensuring that all youth in our community have access to the opportunities that will enable them to thrive, that there is an intentional focus on race. And again, there can be ways that within this language we can, I think, do both acknowledge the other isms as well as to make sure that we don't diminish the importance of race as a factor. Again, in terms of the structures of our policies and practices over time. Now, that being said, as we go back in and try and make some adjustments to this, I would ask your patience in terms of the lack, for lack of a better term, wordsmithing. We're going to make our very best effort to embed these concepts and these themes that have arisen through this conversation. Our goal is to have this in place so that as we enter into this joint board meeting on the 14th, this is a perspective that both boards are acknowledging that we're taking in terms of the planning and the decision making that will sort of be a part of not just that meeting, but sort of our ongoing planning into the future. So.
I also think that as Skip looked at this and looked at it through several different lenses, both nationally and then down at the Fairfax level. I mean, one of the reasons we like the equitable growth profile is it took all of the things that we were hearing nationally and said, well, how does that apply to Fairfax County? What is the difference? And so even I agree that this, for example, doesn't talk a whole lot about language or immigrant or that kind of piece of the population, whereas the equitable growth profile does quite a bit. I think that one of the things that has been informative to me is that in any one of those groups, or in any, so if you look at something like health outcomes, regardless of your economic status, your health outcomes are worse if you fall into minority, not really minority anymore, groups in Fairfax County. So yes, it's true that wealthier people are healthier than poorer people. But then if you look at within the wealthy people, how healthy are they, you still see racial differences. So Skip had this conversation back and forth extensively and felt that it was important to acknowledge that race was a factor within Fairfax County when you were looking at most of these opportunities. Again, not to say I agree that we should specifically, include other groups within the sort of whereas, but that was how it got to race versus poverty, which we discussed at great length.
And just to be clear, though, when you are referring to race, is it all race, or is it also inclusive of ethnicity?
We are also including ethnicity.
Okay, and so I guess some of the data that I've seen since being on the board having to do with student success indicates that actually tremendous success in some racial groups, and I'm just curious as to how do you end up implementing this? I guess because my feeling is that if we're talking about sort of the legacy, ongoing legacy of the civil rights movement of the 60s to promote and to resolve the problems that came out of slavery, then focus on that. I worry a little bit about if we sweep in too many groups and too many isms, as you say, that we dilute the effort that really needs to be targeted.
I think that that's very much where we were going. I think that, quite honestly, the data point that makes us say, well, we have to be a little bit more inclusive, is the outcomes for Hispanic children in our system at this point. Whether we're looking at discipline outcomes, or we're looking at graduation, or we're looking at, and so it seemed necessary to include that aspect of it as well. Although I would agree that sort of the initial driver, if you will, and if you look at similar resolutions and policies across the country, they typically have sort of Black-based, racial-based origin, but then we look at where there is also a very large Hmong population, and they have tweaked their resolution to include that because they can see the differences in outcome there. So I think each community has to look and see what are the factors that are impacting them, and then.
Yeah, and of course the challenge in Fairfax is we're so diverse, right?
And I was just going to add is that, again, as we go back and look at tweaking the language in the resolution, I think the point that you just made is, again, why we focus specifically on race, but I think it's worth an explanation even within the resolution, why we acknowledge the other isms, so to speak, and also think it is important to highlight the particular significance of race. So I think that there can be a way to do both without diminishing.
Yeah, and I guess as sort of the first impression of SCYPT, I would say that targeting the focus and energy of limited resources is going to be a useful thing to sort of keep the spirit and goals intact, because there is an issue of if you try to do too much, you end up not doing anything.
Yeah. And I think that it's important we sort of skip through quickly what the background of SCYPT was. So the 8 areas of focus each have indicators under them, et cetera, but SCYPT has sort of said, okay, what's the priorities that we can take on for the first year? And that's where you saw things like behavioral health and preschool. Those things, like it's sort of like the equity lens is informing them and is a piece of how we disaggregate the data when we look at it and what we're trying to figure out in terms of where do you take those resources and where do you direct them. But the sort of the focus or the different goal areas, equity is underlying, but equity isn't like a specific thing that we're working on.
Yeah, I see the chart. Yeah, I tried
the
to
multicolored
absorb that while you were
chart,
talking,
right?
but I couldn't.
And it is kind of hard, and it's a little thing. Usually it's about this big. And that was the result of a couple different community meetings where we had a lot of probably input from 300 or 400 people over the course of a couple meetings, where we looked at our strategic plan, we looked at the county's strategic plan, we looked at all of these different things, and we looked at where did we have data on, quite honestly, in terms of what indicators could we measure. So yeah, there's a lot of work that SCYPT will do, but this is a piece of the puzzle.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I have Ms. Palchuk followed by Ms. Schultz.
Thank you. As you know, this is very dear to my heart. I have a couple questions, and I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. The resolution we're talking about is just to direct the development of the racial equity policy, correct? Mm-hmm. I know we've had discussions on SHAC about what policy versus regulations are. So for this, I think having done international poverty work and seeing how sometimes when we talk about inclusion, we actually get away from what we're trying to solve. So just want to make sure that there are teeth to this, that this is focused, that there will be regulations, a strategic plan, tracking progress, whether it be equity audits, et cetera.
Yes. I think that the regulation aspect of it may be more embedded in the different topics that it's looking at, right? So in other words, I don't know that we'll have a regulation specifically about equity as much as we will when we're looking at health regulations that we're writing. How are we incorporating that into that lens?
And I guess how will this policy, will it be tied to all these different departments? Because in the end, I'm looking at, I know DC has the Latino office, which has done a really good job of creating partnerships and doing work in the community, creating, partnerships with communities of faith and access at schools and elsewhere. So is this policy going?
The vision would be that the policy would, yes, direct, whether you were then developing something around housing or you're developing something around libraries, or that the policy would direct you to, again, if you think almost through the environmental impact study, that you would be looking at it through an equity lens as part of your overall development of that next policy that's directed, or that next regulation, or the next initiative, whether it be housing or.
And we'll be tracking progress of areas where it's working well and maybe areas where we're having trouble doing that. Okay.
We look at this from, so one, we're going to develop what we've been referring to as a toolkit, which will enable us to be able to apply an equity lens to our overall processes and our understanding of sort of how we go about doing things in terms of the people who are engaged, both people within our systems and people within the community. It'll allow us to consider place as a part of sort of our thinking and our planning and our decision making, and where the power rests within sort of all of that. And so that's, again, fairly high level. I think, this policy is really to develop a way to apply a racial equity lens that would be applicable on both the county government side as well as the school system side. And that may take various shapes and forms, I suspect, but a basic sort of something that, could be utilized. I think it would be difficult to go sort of program by program.
Right.
Just to add like a tangible, what is she describing? So uploaded for you is the blueprint of care recommendation for 3 years. So for example, on page 18, we talk about increased services offered in languages other than English, develop policies and procedures for training around cultural competency for all county contracted providers. So in other words, as we look at the key bucket areas of next steps and action items, that we're including this aspect in everything that we're doing, and then you will see tangibly what are some actions related to this resolution that are going to make a difference in terms of how we're delivering services. So in the case of behavioral health, here's a couple of things. Now, it's not the entire blueprint is not around this, but it's part of the conversation, and it requires of us that we make sure that we include that in our decisions around recommendations. So that's just like an example of what it might look like.
Right.
This is an abstract kind of,
I
and
understand
this is a,
it's hard to have this conversation because it's still very abstract. And,
Right.
But I guess the hope, number one, would be that SCYPT will continue to monitor progress, to have measurements in place. And one thing I did not see here, and I don't know if there's a way to include that as we talk about power, is leadership and opportunities for growth and leadership. I know that wasn't mentioned at all, I believe, other than everyone can participate and prosper. So was there any discussion in the SCYPT about specifically targeting leadership opportunities and growth for?
Yeah, so it's referenced in the equitable growth profile. And again, in some of our more neighborhood-specific strategies, there is absolutely a focus on building leadership and the ability to participate in the governance of the community, so that everyone understands how decisions are made and how to participate in decisions that impact their lives and the lives of their children.
Yeah, I guess I'm just getting to the end of we are a community that is very diverse, and to see that reflected in the county's leadership at every level.
Yes.
Is kind of one of the end goals, or in my mind should be, in order to have ongoing equity and a true one Fairfax.
And that may be something as a policy is developed. That
Okay.
we, again, saying leadership within the county reflective of the ethnicity and
Right.
racial diversity.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Palchek. I now have Ms. Schultz, followed by myself, and then I have one go back so far.
So it's an interesting point that my colleague, Ms. Palchek, made about leadership in the community at every level reflective of its community. And I'm not exactly sure what that means. I don't know if you're trying to intimate that positions be held out. Are you talking for elected roles? Are you talking for PTA presidents? Are you talking for a homeowners association? Are you talking for appointments to I mean, I don't even know what that looks like. And you don't have to answer.
Sure. I mean, it's, so we have a leadership Fairfax, and I saw that they were part of this. So just looking at how we help grow and develop leadership, yes, at, you know, in the community, in the school, and
so
you don't say this is the number of people we have here, but we look at where does the leadership in an institution, in a community, how does it reflect the population that we're looking at, if this is our focus, and can we track progress and programs that may help bring new people and prepare them to either be appointed or elected or whatever it should be.
So being a somewhat of a colleague of one Tom Davis, who set aside 3 at-large seats ostensibly to improve the minority positions on this board, we can see how when we hold out positions ostensibly to improve the minority report structure in the county, how that works out.
So can I clarify?
No.
We find things that work.
No. Yeah, that didn't work. So it concerns me greatly, Mr. Duran, when you say things like provide more services not in English, which to me sounds like the exact opposite of what we should be doing. What we should be doing is providing more opportunities for rapid acquisition of the English language so that we don't need to provide more services not in English. When I see things like ensure racial equity in education, I'm like, okay, well, I have schools where because of FRM status, we're spending half as much, 2/3 again as much as we are in other schools. Is that what racial equity looks like? I just spend more money in a school? Does racial equity look like providing marital counseling so that we keep families whole? I don't even know what this looks like. What it sounds to me like is this is a very comfortable knitting together of concepts and ideas that fit a politically correct narrative. And it makes me extremely uncomfortable that we're going down this path in terms of FCPS and what this means for FCPS, because we already do needs-based staffing. And if we're in a position where we're doing needs-based staffing and it's based on FRM and we're not addressing as a population, as a county, the cultural issues around why we have the FRM status in the first place. And instead of talking about creating lifelong riders of public transportation, we're not talking about creating higher paying jobs so that people don't have to ride public transportation if they don't want to. It's there if they want it. But you know what? Creating opportunity is the best opportunity, the best way to have equity is create more jobs, fill all those commercial real estate vacancies with great companies who can create jobs and internships for kids who need a path to a better income and setting themselves up for a successful life. And so why the discussion isn't around the creation of opportunity for jobs and plugging them into what a healthy family looks like and what a stable career looks like, instead of just addressing the cultural or racial equity that's listed here, is, and granted, I haven't been sitting in all the skipped meetings, but when I don't hear talks about creating economic opportunities through job growth and incentives to create that, then what I see is an underpinning of something that doesn't have a basis in success, because it doesn't have a basis in economics, because it doesn't have a basis in creating a job ladder that helps create what is real opportunity.
One of the things we talked about earlier, for instance, has to do with our technology access. You know, that's something that we're looking at across county and school agencies. Are we giving our kids access via their home, via sites across the county, the libraries, other places, so that kids have access to technology? So that's an example of making them
Dr.
a quote
Lip,
unquote
if they had a
lifelong
job,
learner.
if they had a job and could afford it, then we wouldn't need to give them free access. Do you see what I'm saying?
I see
I'm
what-
talking about the originating argument that's underpinning all of this.
Right, right. But I'm also saying that education is access to that kind of life. And it's about giving the kids access to what they need so we can get them there. Does that make sense?
And if
Okay.
you look at our ultimate outcomes, Ms. Schultz, which is this multicolored document that's also uploaded, it talks about that very point about trying to support students and families to attain education. They need to become employed, to become better citizens. So we do have that ultimate goal, learning English along the way. But for the part that I mentioned with regards to another language, that was in reference to behavioral health support services, where we saw some data where currently we have students who may be suicidal, have mental health crises, that don't have access to those services via their language that they currently speak, needing to provide that support for them while they're in that moment of crisis. That was in reference to that. But again, ultimately, you'll see in our indicators that that is what we're about and we're trying to do. If you look at the key indicator for success under our various listed outcomes, it is really around making sure that students and families have all what they need to ultimately do what you described, to be able to be economically viable in this community and be able to function in a positive way. That's what SCIP's about. I mean, there's much more to what you're describing about the needs outside of SCIPS, as we're focusing really on children, youth, and family, the 9 outcomes that we've listed, but that's ultimately what we're describing. So how do we get there? We've looked at different barriers. We've looked at some of the research that speaks to, in order to get someone there, there are some crises, there are some data that's telling us right now, we have families, we have communities that aren't able to attain it because currently, the state they're in right now, they need some help and they need some support. And that's what we're trying to say here. And I do apologize that we did it so quickly, and hopefully what we anticipate being able to do is be able to come to the board on a more frequent basis, because what we're talking about happened 2 years ago in terms of the development of this. So the conversation and the thinking behind a lot of this, it's hard to put into an hour because a lot of it did go on, and certainly obviously went on before I was here because this was developed 2 years ago. So even myself trying to catch up in all of it. But the point is we want to be able to come to the board in work session format. I know Ms. McLaughlin has been a big advocate for this and has asked for us to be able to come back and share what is the thinking, what are we trying to do, how, because what you just said and what everyone has said is actually part of the discussion that's taken place. Maybe the wording can be tweaked, maybe we can do some different focuses in that area, but what we're trying to do and what we're all about in SCIP is just what you said and what everyone else has said thus far. I didn't hear one person around the table speak to anything that was in contrast to what we've been trying to do.
You bring up a really good point, though, Ms. Schultz. When we started this, I think people always feel safe going to the school indicators and the school actions and what they will do. And we really had to work with the total groups to say, what are we doing as a county? It's not just about the schools.
I appreciate that, Dr. Lip, because that's really the heart of the problem, which is that there's an expectation that a child passes over a transom in one of our schools, and that somehow it becomes, the school system's responsibility to somehow overcome hurdles and barriers that exist far, far beyond and well outside the realm of what a K through 12 system is.
Right.
And unless and until there is an acknowledgement, and that is one of those courageous conversations that needs to be had, but unless and until there's an acknowledgement about how you overcome some of those hurdles, there has to be an acknowledgement that the schools can do but so much, and then what happens outside the four walls of the school has got to have something outside of the school's purview and money to solve, and it doesn't fall on the back of a teacher to solve all of those issues.
Correct.
And that is a fundamental truth that I feel like it's like difficult to say and people don't want to say it, but it is a reality that has to involve something beyond the being put on the burden of the school system and a teacher in a class to solve those issues. And that becomes out there.
Correct.
And it's not, and when I say out there, I don't mean the other side of the government. I mean also the rest of what's happening in a community.
Right. And when we develop the chart, they'll tell you that we had those conversations, because when we took it back to schools, they said, okay, here's our piece of what we're doing, bringing to the table. What's the piece of the greater community? What's the piece of the county, the additional services that are needed outside the schoolhouse walls? And so that was a piece of it, to say it's greater than that. And we had to get beyond that, because again, in a lot of communities across the nation, the easy piece is just to focus in on schools because everybody thinks they know schools. So the greater piece was to say, we all own a piece of it, so to speak. The county, the schools, everyone, and all about, again, it's about access. Are we giving kids access to and opportunities to? And then we can go from there in terms of what everybody's responsibility is. But that's really what drove the conversation.
Ms. Schultz, I want to thank you for really furthering the conversation more broadly to the challenges that we've got with county services as well as educational services, trying to address very real gaps in opportunity and disproportionality. So certainly today's work session isn't going to get us all the way there. I haven't had a chance to speak yet, but Ms. Huff would like to speak, and I'd like to follow protocol, which is the moderator speaks last. So, and I do still have 2 go backs. So Ms. Huff, to you, and Ms. Schultz, I have some thinking that I want to share based on what you're describing.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this question could be answered today, but one question I have about something in the resolution is about the fact that a growing number of local jurisdictions across the United States have adopted an intentional racial equity strategies. I was just curious if there's, what's the best place for me to see what those are and what the positive outcomes they have implemented due to their equity strategies and what we can expect from that.
So we've been, over the last couple of years, participating with a group called the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which brings together jurisdictions from across the country. We have made contacts with folks everywhere from the state of Michigan to Minnesota to the state of Washington, California. And so we can provide links for you that describe, was this uploaded? Yeah, so there's actually in some of the documents that were uploaded, links to information from those jurisdictions that sort of lay out how they have, and again, these are 2 years old, and so if you go to those websites, you'll get to see not only sort of how they were structured 2 years ago, but the progress that they've made since. And so that's been an important part of the work that we've done, is to acknowledge that we're not the only community in this situation, and to sort of learn from other communities about how they have tackled these issues. And I hesitate to frame this as totally as a problem, because it's not. I mean, one of the most significant assets that we have in Fairfax County is our diversity. And so how other communities have been able to build upon their diversity in terms of, sort of building upon, as Ms. Schultz said, their sort of economic growth. So this is all sort of referenced in the It's not in that one?
Not that one, the other. It's actually, if you go on board docs, it's the attachment that's called the Journey to Advance Opportunity and Achieve Equity. It was the board presentation done in 2014. And if you go into that board presentation, there are 4 examples. There are 4, it was the previous presentation, there are 4 examples of other municipalities and what they've done in terms of their equity statements. That one there, yeah. Well, it's pages 10 through 13, I guess, 14.
So if I go there, I'll see what the outcome of
example.
creating these equity statements are.
This doesn't list the outcomes, this lists the actual statements, and then I think what Carla was
Yeah,
saying,
so
if
we
you go
can-
to there.
If we could provide links to the websites, where these were sort of just, to be included in the
Samples.
presentation to show examples of how, just, snapshots of what other communities have done. These communities also have robust information on their websites. Again, because an important part of this is the data and the accountability. So not just to name it as an issue, but to set goals and hold yourself accountable as a collective in terms of meeting those goals. And that information is included there as well.
So we can say.
I would recommend just having sent to Chairman Hines so she can distribute it to the whole board.
Okay.
Ms. Huff, any other comments at this time? Okay, I'd like to speak, and then we do have 2 go-backs. So in listening to everyone's feedback, which I greatly appreciate, I think one of the first things that comes to my mind is I'm a little surprised that the Board of Supervisors at their Human Services Subcommittee had absolutely no edits or suggestions at all. I really appreciate many of my colleagues pointing out even a singular word that can be very powerful, and I think we have to be very, very thoughtful about what this resolution says. And with multiple lawyers in the room and being married to a lawyer, I would think that we could even look at some of this language and think, did everybody really understand what was being said here? So one thought I have, and then I'll give some ideas on where I am. I mean, I've been serving on SCYP now, going on my 3rd year, but I started in September of 2014. So anyway, or maybe it was 2013. What I do remember is that it was December of 2014 that we started to bring this draft resolution to the 2 boards. And the goal originally was that we wanted to get something passed by Martin Luther King 2015 day. We thought, what a great way to honor it. And then this did arrive to our board in December, a year and a half ago, and there was some concerns about the language then. And we didn't have a good process for it coming back. And since I wasn't there to even hear what the board member concerns were, I didn't even realize what people were wrestling with. And I'll be honest with you, I don't even remember that the full SCYP team walked through this line for line. And I've, to my knowledge, never missed a meeting. But regardless, here's what I'm looking at. First of all, Mr. Moon, I appreciate that you brought up the issue of the words historical and current discrimination. I think that we can all agree that people of color have borne the legacy of discrimination. Getting into, his legacy and historical are really both talking similarly. Current discrimination, I worry about what that signals to our county services, whether it's schools or county government. Are we really accusing or stating that we believe that Fairfax County discriminates? So I wonder if we want to honor in a resolution that we've had a legacy of discrimination. If it's still persisting, if it stopped a couple years ago, but I think the focus needs to be we have a legacy of discrimination and we need to now, to address that legacy. I think that when we look at the 5th bullet where it says, whereas we must ensure racial equity in education, is it that we're striving for it? I don't know what control a county government or a school system has to ensure it. because there are things that, as Ms. Schultz pointed out, are outside of all of our control. We can have the best social workers in the world, we can have the best school system in the world, and there are things that are going to be beyond our control. If we're striving for equity, or if we're looking at a way that something about we commit, that we commit to racial equity, I think we are committed to it. How we ensure it, though, I worry, because I think this school system's been very committed to closing the achievement gap, but we haven't been able to ensure it. We're committed to it. So that's where I think, we might be more effective with our language. And to page 2 at the top, I think that echoes what I just shared with you. Whereas Fairfax County recommits to ensuring that all residents have access to opportunity, that is something we can do. We can absolutely commit to ensuring access. And that, to me, is one of the most fundamental statements in here that I believe we can honor as two elected bodies. But in terms of then, if you go down to now therefore be it resolved, second section, where it says that provides both the direction and the means to dismantle any and all structural arrangements that produce or maintain disparities. We have school systems right now, because they are neighborhood schools, that we have disparity in terms of the poverty. I'm searching for my word to say, but our poverty rates, our diversity within our schools. So, that's to me very intentional language. And have we really had that conversation, whether the SCYPT committee, the board of supervisors, the school board? I'm saying, are we really ready to produce or to dismantle any and all structures? I mean, what are we going to do with our current housing? We're going to dismantle it because it's one of those issues we have. Are we going to start where I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina? Every year they redrew their boundaries and they redistributed student populations, and it was massive countywide busing. I mean, those are the things that I don't know if anybody else read this, but it is such a well-intentioned resolution, and I want to honor the work, but I do think that there's some statements in here that, I circled legal implications. I don't know if John Foster has looked at this, but I mean, again, if we're a school board and we're going to pass this resolution, what kind of, I'm sort of recommending, I think our general counsel's office should be looking at this. I would recommend the county's attorney look at this, because it is going to be a public document, and I want us to be able to honor everything that's in it. But I also want us to be very mindful of what this resolution, in my mind, is promising to the very communities we represent. So I know I've kind of throwing a lot out there, but I think it's because I really want to embrace this and celebrate what this would mean for our county to have both boards do this. And so I guess I would invite Carla and Francisco, and actually Jane or Marianne, you all serve on SCYPT with me. I'm sorry Ms. Darnat Koufax couldn't be here, but I did speak with her briefly before she left. And this language, some of it gave her pause. She wasn't ready to put up her hand today and say, we're good to go, throw it on the agenda June 9th. So one thought I had is we are meeting with SCYPT on June 1st, the whole SCYPT committee. So one option is that staff working together, county and schools, take some of this input here. Tammy and I could work with Jeff and Kathy Hudgens, get it really kind of shaped out based on some of this input and your all's recommendations, bring it to SCYPT and say, based on this, and in fact, if John Foster weighs in or county attorney weighs in, we might have something June 1st that says, now do we think this has got us this fully vetted? And because I really think that's a fair thing to be saying, is that it's any changes at all coming back to the SCYPT committee to say this is the input from at least the school board, and then we might have the best document possible. That's my recommendation. At this point, I would like to call on the people who have go-backs, and Mr. Moon, you signaled you would like a go-back, please?
Yes,
Or did you have a question to what I said?
Yeah, have a question regarding, what you, based upon what you have just said. You've been a member of a SCIP team for last 3 years,
Two
2.5,
2.5, yeah.
2.5 years. And this language, if this did not go through a SCIP team,
It did.
I do not recall that we vetted this entire document. So if I was not at that
because,
meeting.
County Board of Supervisors Subcommittee
Mhm.
did not really add anything to what came out of SCIP team's meeting.
Right.
And there seems to be some disconnect.
Well, I wasn't there at their Human Services Committee. I don't know how much time they spent talking about it. What I do know, Mr. Moon, is when this was first presented to our board a year and a half ago, our board looked at the language and said, wow, that's a lot to be said. And people didn't want to, I mean, at that meeting, our board could have gone like this, and they didn't. So anyway.
I think at the first board meeting when we came, there was actually more conversation. I don't think we even really got into the discussion of this. I think the conversation was primarily on a little bit of confusion about why SCIP was bringing forward anything that had to do with this at all, because wasn't SCIP just about preschool? And so there was a lot of just general conversation, and we sort of just then said we would come back at a different time.
Ms. Panarelli, I appreciate that, but I remember, since I missed the meeting and I conferred with Ms. Kofax, that in fact there was concern about the language, because people were saying, are we only talking about race equity? What about poverty? Do we want to make it a focal point? So
Right,
that's
from the
what
whole
was brought to me.
Right from the whole presentation, which we posted again, but we didn't get into a line-by-line conversation about the resolution itself.
To Mr. Moon's question, Ms. Strauss served with me during this time period because Ms. Kofax just joined in September, I believe. So, Ms. Strauss, do you remember the extent of the review that we did with this?
I was going to say I'm fine with this as written, but so I won't upset the apple cart. I can support what's here.
So anyway, I have the two go backs. It was Ms. Corbett Sanders followed by Ms. Hines.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to reiterate that I think this is the work you're doing is really important. And it's important because this warrants a very deliberate and intent-filled approach to how we handle equity in Fairfax County. It also warrants that it has to be a collaborative effort because, as Mrs. Schultz rightfully acknowledged, we can only handle so much during the school day, and we are charged by virtue of lack of supports elsewhere to care for the whole child 24/7 in many cases because of food deprivation, access to, we have children that wake up in a trailer, go to school on a school bus, go to school in a trailer, and come back to a trailer. And so, not having access to enrichment programs, not having access to playgrounds, not having access to sports fields in their communities. Some of that is our responsibility. Some of it's the county's responsibility. And each one of those efforts creates an opportunity for a child to grow and to set goals and believe that anything is possible. And that's what, as a lifelong resident of Fairfax County, I grew up in an environment where I knew everything was possible for me. And so this statement provides a framework for all of the county services, not just the school system, to be very deliberate and intentional in how we move forward in this area. It also sets a framework for required collaboration between county services at the county level as well as within the school system. And so I really welcome what you're doing. If it requires a a review by legal, that's absolutely an appropriate thing to do. I would have thought that before it went to either one of these boards, it would have been done.
I think because it's not the actual policy, it was a resolution that action had not been taken. But you're right, we should probably do that. But I think the thinking at the time, as Ms. McLaughlin pointed out, was that it would be a resolution sort of announcing that we ought to look into an equity policy.
Well, and the other part of this, and this is to address my colleague, Ms. Palchek's comments, because I took them to heart, is what are the outcomes that we expect? I think the outcome is the intentionality, is that if we have a joint resolution between the two boards, there's an intentionality, and I, for one, will look at the work of our board with the intention of how does this impact our ability to ensure that we have equity for all of our students. And I would expect that the other county organizations would look at it of how do we ensure that we are having equity when we provide these services. So thank you.
Ms. Hines?
Yeah, thank you. So I think a couple of things. It's fine to have John Foster look at it. I think it certainly can't hurt. I don't see this, to me, this is a vision document, really. It doesn't bind us to do anything but have a common vision, really. So words like ensure and dismantle don't worry me. You know, I think that's just the direction we're trying to go in. I'm fine with it the way it is. And it has, except for the one comment that I think several of us made, is that if we can broaden the language a little bit to include, you know, family income, home language, that's the kind of things that we look at as a school system, right? So not everything, not every possible subgroup, just those things that we do look at. So I'd be happy to kind of try to shepherd this through, because I think that the June 14 goal is a good one for us, and I think we can get there. So I guess I'm not sure what has to happen then, but if the executive committee of SCYPT maybe needs to get back together with new language and then get back, if we want to vote on it on June 9th, then that just means that it would be good for us to have it as new business on May 26th. So that would probably be our goal.
Ms. Hines, I appreciate that. I did hear other board members, though, talking about the fact that when we're talking about current and or historical discrimination, that there was some conversation about how we could phrase that. I didn't hear universal.
Gotcha. And I think if you want to have a show of hands now, I'm not sure that would be helpful. I think maybe what we ought to do instead is leave it in there, and then before we get to May 26th, presumably you and Ms. Naranat-Kofax will be, and Dr. Duran and these folks will be part of drafting it, and maybe it makes sense to call around. I'm not sure that we can have a really helpful conversation right now.
No, I
about
think if the
current or
board is
past racial discrimination,
no,
because that may get us down a rabbit hole we don't want to go down.
Correct. I think that if there's comfort with the board, then Ms. Kofax and I can meet with not only the team that's here with us today, but try and schedule, even if it's a conference call with the SCYPT Executive Committee before we meet, on before we need it on new business on May 26th. And then certainly when we have our June 1st SCYPT committee meeting, we can certainly bring back to the full SCYPT that if there are any changes that came out of the executive committee, we would be able to have that conversation with the full SCYPT. Because again, you can always end up being able to amend something that gets posted at new business. I mean, we've done that before. So, but I think that sounds like a good goal. Can I see a show of hands if people are comfortable with what Chairman Hines has laid out in terms of Ms. Kofax and I working with Supervisor McKay, Supervisor Hudgens, and our executive committee of SCYPT to iron out any changes in the language, including what Ms. Evans had talked about, and Ms. Hines just capturing up some of the other populations we work with in our schools that we want to make sure are represented in the resolution. I'm going to see a show of hands. Okay. So that's the majority that's here this afternoon. So with that, I want to thank everybody for your engagement, and I'll make sure and follow up offline with everybody, the team. Thank you again for coming to present to us. And I do know, Ms. Hines, the only other thing that you and I talked about was that we'd wanted to get a sense of the board if they would like for SCYPT to be considered for future work sessions to be added as needed. So could I see a show of hands if you all welcome SCYPT being placed on the work session agenda at the discretion of the chair and vice chair as needed? Does that make sense? Okay, great. Then I can report that back to SCYPT too. All right, thank you, everybody.
Okay, next up is facilities. Mrs. Schultz and Ms. Huff are going to take over. 3 minutes.